Okay, I'm Elisa Grammer. I've been the project manager for this state grant, and it's been the product of a team of West Newbury volunteers, plus our health agent, Paul Savigny, and our consultant, Ellie Baker. At the outset, please note that we are recording this session and it will be on the internet. Next slide, please. Here's what we'll be doing this evening. We'll be starting with presentations. First, our consultant, Ellie Baker, will give a quick overview of the Commonwealth's MVP process and the state's data about what West Newbury should expect in terms of climate change. Then second core team member Rick Parker will talk about the conclusions we reached through a consensus process about our vulnerabilities and strengths and actions we can take ideally with state grant money. After the presentations, we'll turn to your comments and questions. And a bit of housekeeping before we go forward about this GoToMeeting session. Again, this meeting is being recorded and will go on the internet. Please mute yourself unless you're speaking. On the computer, you do that by clicking the little microphone by your name. If you're on the phone, please dial *6 to mute or unmute yourself. You can adjust what's on your screen using the camera view at the top of the GoToMeeting screen, and also there's that line at the top you can adjust to make the presentation larger if you'd like. When it comes time for questions, please type your questions or your comments in the chat box, and if you're on the phone, please dial *6 to unmute yourself. Next slide, please. Is there anyone who is on the phone who is not identified at this point?
It does look like we do have someone on the phone, and I'm going to unmute them.
Could you please identify yourself so we'll have a list of the attendees?
Yes, Judy Bloomgarden.
Hi, Judy.
Hi.
So one last thing before we get to the real session, I just add that you can find extensive information on this whole thing on the Municipal Vulnerability page on the town website, including the final report, workshop presentations, these listening session slides, and information about how you can continue to submit comments or questions by email or voicemail up to July 9th. And now let's begin with Ellie Baker's presentation. Thanks.
All right. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. My name is Ellie Baker. I'm an environmental planner with the Horsley Witten Group, and I've had the pleasure of working with the dedicated West Newbury MVP working group since last fall, when the group secured a grant from the state of Massachusetts to undertake an MVP planning workshop. So the working group members are shown here on the slide, and I just want to acknowledge each of them for their work in the workshop and in preparing all the materials and process. So Elisa Grammer, Paul Savigny, Liz Callahan, Richard Parker, Rick, Wendy Reed, Patricia Reeser, Chip Wallace, and Nancy Powell. So those folks have been working really hard to help me get through this process over the last 6 or 7 months. So thank you all. Next slide, please. So I want to start, before we get into the workshop itself, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Commonwealth of what the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has been doing in the realm of vulnerability preparedness and climate adaptation. The Commonwealth has been very actively working on resiliency issues for a number of years. And beginning back in 2016, Governor Baker issued Executive Order 569, which directed the state to assist municipalities to reduce vulnerability and improve resilience to climate change. So the state established the MVP, Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs about 3 or 4 years ago, and they initiated the MVP grant program to support municipal vulnerability preparedness planning. So that's kind of a mouthful, but basically what this did was allowed the state to support communities in their efforts to reduce climate vulnerabilities and improve their resiliency efforts. So this grant program supports municipal vulnerability preparedness planning, which is what this workshop that we did in West Newbury was all about and what we're telling you about today. But they also established a grant program for implementation of the recommendations that come out of this planning process. So there have been several rounds of grants to date, the most recent of which was in February. And this awarded over $11.5 million to Massachusetts municipalities. So the other thing that happened in February, which was exciting, it was the Resilient Massachusetts legislation was filed, which would generate $1.3 billion over 10 years to work toward municipal resilience. This money would be generated from real estate transfers across the state, and a portion of that money, not all of it, but a portion of that money will continue to fund the MVP program planning grants, as well as the action grants that I told you about, to help communities to implement the recommendations that are generated in all of this planning and to improve resilience throughout the state. So the map on the lower right-hand corner shows obviously the state of Massachusetts. Any community shown on that map in blue, light blue, dark blue, or yellow is participating in the MVP program in some capacity at this point in time. So as you can see, the vast majority of communities are participating, and the state is poised to continue this program over the next 10 years, which is great news for West Newbury and the rest of the state. Next slide, please. So Executive Order 569 also initiated the creation of a really great climate change information clearinghouse for the state of Massachusetts. So this is a website essentially that can be found at www.resilientma.org. And this website is being maintained and constantly updated by the state of Massachusetts. So I would encourage you to look here first if you're looking for more information about climate change impacts and resilience tools that you might be able to put to use in West Newbury. So in addition, Executive Order 569 also kickstarted the creation of the Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. So this plan was adopted in September of 2018 and is now being implemented under guidance of the MVP program, as well as the Massachusetts Environmental Management Agency. So the reason I point this out is that this plan can also serve as a really good source of information, as well as a good framework for how to evaluate hazards and vulnerabilities and what kinds of adaptation steps you might think about on a local level, but also to understand what the state is going to be implementing as well. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to turn to climate change itself and talk a little bit, provide a brief synopsis of what we can expect for climate change here in this region. And I presented, along with a colleague, presented much more information about this at the workshop that we had a couple months ago, but I just want to give a little bit of context here for this presentation today. So stepping back to a wide lens, we can expect to see more extreme weather around the world in the years and decades to come with climate change. But at the local scale in northeastern Massachusetts, we can expect changes in temperature, precipitation, and sea level, which will result in changing weather patterns, changes in the frequency and severity of storm events, and natural hazards such as flooding and drought. Next slide, please. So researchers from the Northeast Climate Science Center at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst were enlisted by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to develop some projections of temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise for the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And these projections were downscaled from sort of the northeastern United States down to local county level and watershed level in Massachusetts. So the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs has provided support for these projections to enable municipalities like yourselves, as well as industry, organizations, state government, et cetera, to use these as peer-reviewed climate change projections. So the information I'm going to be presenting today and which was presented at the workshop, you know, you can trust it as peer-reviewed information. So my next few slides will present highlights from that data, looking out to the middle of the century and the end of the century. So this one that you're looking at, and actually, Nancy, I don't know if you hit forward again, I think the map will pop up.
The first Massachusetts map with the 22% by 2050?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, go back. Is there a map on the right-hand side of the projected temperature increases?
Hold on. Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So the annual average temperature is projected to increase by about 5 degrees by mid-century and by about 10 degrees by the end of the century here in our area. So with that, the growing season is expected to be twice as long in 2100 as it is now. And we can expect to be spending a lot less money to heat our houses and a lot more money to air condition them as we move forward. So depending on which carbon emissions scenario we ultimately find ourselves following, we may be feeling more like Washington, D.C. or even South Carolina than Massachusetts by the end of the century. And that's what's shown here in that graphic that you see. Next slide, please. So a few highlights about the projected precipitation changes. The average annual precipitation, which includes both rain and snow in West Newbury, is projected to increase by up to 22% by the middle of the century and up to 35% by 2100. And the largest increases in precipitation are expected to occur in winter, which would come increasingly in the form of rain instead of snow in the wintertime due to the increased temperatures. At the same time, the greatest increase in consecutive dry days is expected to occur in the fall. And together, these conditions, these changes can lead to increased flood events in winter and springtime and increased drought in summer and fall. The figure above, the figure that you're looking at represents drought conditions experienced in 2016. And you can see that we in eastern Massachusetts were experiencing significant drought with the dark red. And I just happened to read today that the Ipswich River is currently experiencing conditions similar to those of 2016 when that drought was beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, so sea levels are also expected to rise, and we're seeing them rise. And as you know, West Newbury is located along the tidal section of the Merrimack River. By the end of the century, sea level at the tidal gauge in Kittery, Maine, is expected to rise as much as 4 feet in sort of the medium percentile emissions projection. So it could be more than that. You've probably seen projections that are a lot higher than that. But one way to sort of estimate where the likely impacts from sea level rise will occur in your community is to look at the current FEMA flood zone map. So that's what you see here on the figure. And the areas in red are the 100-year flood zone, and the areas in orange are the 500-year flood zone. And one way to look at these is to understand that those areas within the 100-year floodplain currently experience a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. That's essentially what a 100-year flood zone is. So that chance of flooding is expected to increase with sea level rise, meaning that flooding will likely occur more frequently in those red and orange areas over the next 50 to 100 years. Next slide, please. And the changing climate is also expected to produce more powerful storms with more wind in both warm weather storms like hurricanes and winter storms like nor'easters. This increased wind can lead to more downed trees and limbs, as you see here, which also results in more frequent power outages and road closures. Next slide, please. So I also want to talk a little bit about the health impacts of climate change. There are a number of public health impacts that we should be thinking about as we anticipate climate change. Some of these include an increase in vector-borne illnesses such as Lyme disease and triple E, an increase in food and waterborne infections due to the increased air and water temperatures in our environment, and physical and mental health impacts of traumatic events such as flooding and extreme heat, or the events that we are currently experiencing. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pivot a little bit here. I want to tell you a little bit about the actual MVP planning process that we undertook in West Newbury, and then I'll turn it over to Rick Parker, one of your selectmen and a member of the working group, to present the outcomes from the process. So back in February, just before the quarantine, on the last day of February, we managed to fit in one last face-to-face event, and this was the MVP working group hosted a workshop at the town annex, and we had over 40 participants. And the purpose of this workshop was really to think about what are the vulnerabilities that the community is facing in light of all these anticipated climate changes that we talked about, and what are some primary priority actions that the town could get started on right away to address some of these vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. So just a few key terms that we talked about at the workshop, and then I want to be sure that everyone on the phone here is aware of as we talk about this. These terms here, vulnerability, resilience, and adaptation, I took these definitions from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And what we're talking about here is, vulnerability is sort of the degree to which a system is susceptible or unable to adapt to change or adverse impacts of climate change. So we talked a lot about where the community is vulnerable to climate change. And then we talked about resilience, or the ability of the system or the community and its component parts to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from the effects of a hazardous event, including through ensuring the preservation, restoration, or improvement of its essential basic structures and functions. So resilience is sort of the ability of the community and the environment to bounce back. And then adaptation is another important element of this. Adaptation is the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate the harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. So what we talked about were the vulnerabilities, and then what we could do to improve the resilience of the system and to adapt and make change to prepare and adapt for changes. Next slide, please. And when we talked about the different types of actions that we could take to improve resilience or to adapt to climate change, we took a broad view of the different types of actions that the community could take. So we talked about some fixes, considered fixes that were more engineering type fixes or construction projects, perhaps to change culverts or drainage patterns, etc. We also talked about and considered protection and conservation of land, water, habitat, etc. We talked about retreat and avoidance of different areas. This is particularly relevant when you're thinking about floodplains, but it could apply to other areas or other habitat areas that you may want to retreat from to avoid harm. And then there are obviously actions that could be taken that are less sort of construction or land-based, but in the planning realm. So there are a lot of planning actions that you can take to think about how to plan for more open space, or how to plan for emergencies, or plan for different energy resources, etc. And then along with that, there are policy and regulatory changes that can be considered. And each of these actions can be undertaken on varying timescales. So short-term things, long-term, policy change may be sort of a long-term process, and then ongoing items. Next slide, please. So prior to the workshop that we held in February, we did a lot of background research and information gathering. And so the working group, or the core team that I worked with, did most of this work, but we reviewed climate change data from the website and from other resources, as I mentioned, and also looked at existing town planning documents to see what types of actions and recommendations had already been sort of identified. We surveyed townspeople, we did a survey, and some of you may have participated in this. There was a survey that was available online, as well as some of you may have done it in person at the supermarket or in other locations around town, where we tried to understand from people what the vulnerabilities were that they could that they were considering, and then also what types of actions they thought were relevant. We also identified key stakeholders ranging from public health officials, public safety officials in town, school representatives, senior citizens, and others, to try to understand on a more individual level from stakeholders with different perspectives around town what the vulnerabilities were, or what they saw as the vulnerabilities to some of these climate changes. And then from that, we took that information and identified 4 priority hazards that were associated with climate change in West Newbury that the group thought should be considered and evaluated at the workshop. So I'll go through what those were. Next slide, please. So these 4 priority hazards that we discussed at the workshop were severe storms, or the increase in number and intensity of wind, nor'easters, and hurricanes; changing precipitation patterns, including changes in intensity, volume, flooding, drought; diseases and invasive species, and how those might evolve in the community, including increases in ticks, mosquitoes, Lyme, triple E, knotweed, bittersweet, other invasives. And then the last one was temperature extremes. So as I mentioned, we're expecting warmer winters, warming trends overall, and then with that comes increased volatility. And we've already, you may recognize this from the year we've had already, where there's just a volatility and swings of temperature back and forth. Next slide, please. So the workshop itself was held, as I said, on February 29th in the town annex. And what we did in that workshop, it was a full day workshop. We had 42 community members came to the meeting and participated, and it was a very active day. We first examined the town's climate change vulnerabilities and strengths. We broke out into groups and talked about, within the realm of infrastructure, environment, and society, we talked about what might be some of the key vulnerabilities and that we need to address, and what are some of the key strengths that we should work to conserve or protect. So just some examples of that. Infrastructure vulnerabilities included power outages. That was a big topic of conversation in the breakout groups. Among the environment, the vulnerabilities included, for example, insect-borne diseases, and strengths identified included all of the wetlands in town: wetlands, ponds, streams, rivers. That's a great resource for the community for both habitat, the ability to absorb flooding, and also sort of obviously contributes to a source of water in the community. So after the discussion of vulnerabilities and strengths, we talked about actions that could be taken to address those. And then we had every group report out to the entire workshop on the actions that they had identified, and we went through a prioritization process to try to lump some of those that overlapped with each other, and then essentially discuss and vote and sort of prioritize which ones rose to the top. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Parker to present to you what these actions were that came out of this very active workshop. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ellie. Appreciate your presentation. So as Ellie has explained, the town's MVP process was designed to answer 2 questions in anticipation of climate change effects. What are the town's key vulnerabilities and strengths? And what priority action should the town be taking, and where possible, use MVP action grants to accomplish? Following the February 29th workshop, we compiled a final list of recommended priority actions, 8 in total. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The first of those is to enhance emergency communication information and infrastructure. That would include improving the cellular wireless system. There are currently numerous areas in town with weak or no cell reception, and the landlines are potentially unreliable and impacted by storm events. We need to review and maintain lists of vulnerable populations and the means to communicate with them, and potentially enhance the code red service by expanding the messaging and ensuring that its contact list is as comprehensive as possible. This would all be done to address emergency preparedness. The next priority action is related to open space preservation. We should continue to implement our open space and recreation plan, likely including additional open space acquisition. Geographic Information Systems analysis, typically referred to as GIS, can be used to evaluate the equitable distribution of open space across town so that everyone benefits from the advantages. We should prioritize continued support of the Community Preservation Act as a source of funding for protection of open space. Green infrastructure projects should be employed as a resilient means of addressing stormwater management. And open space management practices can be modified and improved to better address invasive species. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. Additionally, we can improve land use controls, bylaws, and policies to protect and preserve our forests and wetlands. And as example, in the case of land subdivision and development, this might include standards to maintain forest and tree canopy and management of existing fields to prevent their being overcome by invasive species. Finally, the town should consider an update of our 1999 comprehensive plan, 20 years old at this point, in part to help steer development in the best interest of the town. The next point is water supply development and water supply protection planning. This may include working with Newburyport to address the outlet dam of the Artichoke Reservoir to reduce the potential contamination of our water supply by the Merrimack in the event of flooding backflow by river water carrying combined sewer overflows, known as CSOs. West Newbury currently obtains something in the range of 30 to 40% of its annual water supply from the city of Newburyport because our own well fields are not currently capable of meeting all of the demand. Equally important, a new water supply source or sources should be sought and developed over time. The fourth point is to consider building a microgrid for the municipal campus to ensure continued electrical power in the event of utility outage. The municipal campus includes the town office building, the annex, the contiguous senior housing, and the public safety complex. The microgrid would be comprised of diverse energy sources, including at least some form of green energy production and backup storage. The next action would be to improve educational communications around climate change and preparedness. This could be done through outreach using the library, schools, and senior services. We should educate in general on climate hazard awareness and potential climate-related disease issues. Next is to make sure we've adequately identified and are able to communicate with vulnerable populations, which would most importantly include seniors and disabled persons. The Council on Aging is an important asset for this action. The seventh point is stormwater and flood management. We can develop and improve our stormwater plan to include mapping, culvert analysis, and assessing vulnerable neighborhoods. River Road in particular was identified as a vulnerability. And finally, To reduce our contribution to the factors causing climate change, we should promote town-owned electric vehicles and equipment, reduce both residential and municipal waste, and increase use of composting at residences and within the school system, either on-site or using an outside composting service. Our next steps would be to gather feedback from this listening session and add an appendix to our final report. After submitting that report to the state and receiving MVP certification, the town will be set up to pursue MVP action grants and to take ongoing actions to improve West Newbury's resilience to climate change. There are a couple of ways to provide feedback. If you're participating in the live session right now, please use the chat box to comment or ask questions. And I see that there are a bunch of items in the chat box. That's good. If you're viewing the presentation after the live session or prefer to submit comments another way, you can leave a voicemail message at 978-363-1100, extension 141. That's the main town office's number, phone number, extension 141. Or send an email to wnmvp.listen@gmail.com. Again, that's WN as in West Newbury, MVP.listen@gmail.com. Please comment by July 9th, 2020. Thanks so much for your time. We're hoping for great feedback and ideas. Now, Wendy Reed will wrap things up.
Thanks, Rick. So we're really interested in any comments that any of you might have, if you agree or disagree with the priorities that we decided on and actions, or if you have questions about what some of these action items might mean or how they might apply to your area of town. So as Rick mentioned, you can either just put your name in the chat box and we'll unmute you so you can ask your own question, or you can write a question or comment in the chat box and I'll read it. All right, Jean Lambert, you have a question, don't you?
I do. I will stop writing it and I will ask it.
Okay.
Okay. I'm asking this half facetiously. I understand the value in preserving open space, of preserving the tree canopy and all of that. Rick mentioned preserving open space from dealing with the invasive species involved in that. And I ask only half facetiously, does that include developers seeking large developments that would reduce our carbon storage? No, it's an issue. I mean, we're getting more and more developed, and I understand you can't stop development, but are there any plans to look at how development of the town fits in with the larger picture of climate change and preserving what we have going forward, or even working to better that open space?
Yeah, I think one of the action items that we talked about was the comprehensive plan, as Rick mentioned. I mean, really, we need that kind of document in place so that we can plan forward instead of reactively. So that's definitely that was one of the most talked about action items among the core team.
Thank
yeah,
you.
I think that's an interesting point, an interesting way to phrase things, Jean, but it's a point well taken. And as Wendy said, you know, the comprehensive plan, what we need well thought out documentation to substantiate whatever we try to protect. If we think that, you know, I mean, land development is at some level a legal process. And if we, you know, we need documents to steer us that will hold up under close inspection. So yeah.
Thank you. So it seems to be a value.
Yes, definitely. Mike McCarron asks, do you think the town has the will to install more cell towers? I don't know. Does anybody from the committee want to comment on that? I'm not sure.
I actually would be happy to comment on that. Sorry, I don't mean to blab, and tell me if I say too much, but so, you know, we have a cell tower bylaw at this point, and it could be argued that it's excessively strict, and that it actually precludes our being able to improve our communications, the communication systems in town. If we do update our comprehensive plan, undoubtedly one of the items addressed there would be communications. Or maybe I shouldn't say undoubtedly, but I would hope that one of the issues addressed there would be communications. And you know, the planning board might be asked, might see the need to relook at the existing bylaw to better facilitate the cellular network.
We have a comment from Fred. Maintaining forest cover will address a number of issues, including stormwater management, water supply, offset air conditioning needs, and so on. We need to have an enforceable plan to maintain current cover, 57%, or even to enhance it. We also should have a tree replanting scheme. And as many of you know, Fred is the chair of the newly formed tree committee. So this is an issue that's near and dear to his heart for sure. Angus Jennings has commented, under FCC regulation, cell towers are treated more as infrastructure than as commercial development. Local regulations has far less jurisdiction than they did pre-2010 when the new FCC regs took effect. Were you aware of that, Rick?
Yeah, but when I understand that it's viewed as infrastructure and that there are FCC regulations that that accommodate or are intended to accommodate or promote the cellular network as infrastructure, but our bylaws are structured in such a way they're very limiting, and that's what I was referring to.
Am I off mute?
No, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, this is Angus. I didn't intend to take the conversation off track. It was more of an aside. It's less central to this topic, but it would justify a different conversation. The 2010 regs, I was in Westford for those 3 years, and they didn't want cell towers just as much as a lot of people didn't want cell towers. And you know, we got an education in that. You have 150 days. It's essentially as of right. If the gap analysis shows a need, basically you know, you can do things to affect design, but you can't stop it.
Yeah, part of what you need is location, and West Newbury has done a fairly good job of preventing location on any town-owned property.
Yep.
And maybe using quotes.
Jean Lambert had another question regarding River Road.
You singled out River, thank you, Wendy. You singled out River Road in terms of stormwater and flood management as your point number 7. Is that generally, or are there specific areas that you're honing in on? I've noticed since the pandemic, the road has become increasingly popular for recreation.
Yeah, I think that when we said River Road, it was just a generality. There are several spots along River Road that tend to flood, as you know. We also identified a couple areas, other areas in town that were potential problem areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm getting a little bit of feedback, Nancy. Oh, that's better.
Yeah.
Jennifer Hughes, who's with Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, is on the session with us, and she's asking, will you be looking to the priority actions of neighboring communities to see if any align with West Newbury's for a possible regional action grant proposal?
This is Elisa. I think that's a great idea to do. I think one of the things that we need to be aware of is that we don't have a staff of thousands to manage a grant going forward or any project going forward. And the more that we can team up and act collaboratively, the better. So I think that's a great idea, Jennifer.
Yeah, and the other thing is that, you know, storm or climate change doesn't recognize town boundaries, right? I mean, so that would be an effective way to deal with it, to get, you know, multiple towns together. So
Yeah, I would, I guess ask back, Jennifer, if you're aware, obviously, you know, being with our regional planning agency, you know, being the environmentally focused person with our regional planning agency, if you're aware of specific overlaps in our priority actions with other communities, undoubtedly we should do a little research on our own, but if you're aware of specific overlaps, it would be great to know of those, and obviously this might be a place where MVPC becomes part of the process. Thanks for the question, though.
Sure, and this is Jennifer Hughes, and I know Groveland right now is actually going through the process as well, so I haven't seen that their priority actions, you know, have been out or there's listening sessions. So I think, you know, to some extent we can wait, but you know, Ellie has worked on regional projects. I think Ellie, you're doing one right now with Newburyport and Newbury, correct? So they're out there, they're good examples, and we do have a clearinghouse of everyone's action items, and we'd be happy to be including yours in that too.
great, thank you.
Jennifer, where is Groveland in their process right now? Would it make sense for anybody from the core team to try to sit in on a meeting?
I'll check in on that. I'm actually not sure. I haven't heard much about their process yet.
Yeah.
And is your clearinghouse online, or is it available for us to look at? Or is it proprietary?
Yes, I'll get you that link.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, at the last Open Space Committee meeting, a woman from the Groveland Conservation Commission joined us, and she's very interested in managing invasives in open space areas. And so we're looking at a potential collaboration for the Great Break Hill area between Groveland and West Newbury. So that maybe that's a possible action that could be rolled into this.
This is Nancy. Another thing is that the high school students that were involved in some of these climate actions and promotion, they were really interested in including all three towns in the Pawtucket school system, because they didn't want to just limit it to their towns, because their friends, you know, they have friends in the other two towns. So I think checking specifically those two other towns, Merrimack and Groveland, does make sense.
Mm-hmm.
This is Ellie Baker. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to add the regional approach or regional proposals for the action grants are, they get extra points essentially, and the state is really encouraging different communities to try to work together on themes that, you know, cross municipal boundaries. So, you know, consider that, you know, you might be able to be eligible for a larger pot of money and have a greater impact with the project if you cross over town boundaries, you know, and tying it into the schools and having that sort of link to public outreach and education that you always get when you're working with the school systems is also a great benefit. You know, it sort of gives you a little extra boost in your proposals. So that's something to consider. There's, you know, there's other guidelines on the action grants that everybody should look at. We didn't go through that on this workshop, but they're out there in the RFP. So that's something to think about. And there was something else I was going to say. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I did work with Newbury and Newburyport on their MVP processes about a year and a half ago, and both of them considered a lot of very similar themes to what you all talked about in West Newbury. And in particular, Newburyport identified their water supply as something to be thinking about, as well as the CSO and water quality issue related to that. So keep that in mind as well. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ellie. We have a comment from Jack. Can an education campaign promoting the benefits of MVP to the community that includes outreach to the general public in schools be a component of a future state funding proposal? I don't know if anybody from the core team wants to comment on that.
I think that's something to look into also. One thing that we've been fortunate about is that there has been a cadre through the Pentucket High School of students who are interested in environmental issues, and there's an environmental club, and the environmental club teacher and some of the students came to our workshop. Of course, the students, darn them, graduate, and then we need new ones. But for sure, I think we need to maintain that contact and maybe, think about something like that. I think that's a very good point.
Angus had a comment in terms of the planning document. He said, I, for one, would greatly favor a comprehensive planning effort. In the near term, a full master plan process per MGL and best practices isn't in the cards, but a more condensed strategic planning retreat to prioritize among many competing priorities could add a lot to prospects for plan implementation, such as OSRP, Housing Production Plan, MVP, and otherwise.
I'm just wondering, is that something that we could ask for an action grant to fund?
We did retreats along those lines in Westford, totally with in-house resources. So I think with the right coordination among the groups, I don't necessarily see it as a dollar item as much as an organizational item.
Okay.
We could take that offline. It'd be great to work together.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Angus also responded to Jack's comment that under the town's work implementing our MS4 stormwater management permit, we have a pretty active collaboration engagement among the schools as part of our public education and outreach section of our permit. Expanding to climate change awareness should be a natural fit. That's a really good point. That's required under the MS4 process, so it might be good to piggyback on that. And then Nancy Powell just commented to Ellie that multi-town grants, including schools and outreach, compete better in the state.
Oh, I was just capturing what Ellie said on the phone.
Oh, okay. All right, the next comment is what. Erin Rich comment that she's here with a student, recent PRSD grad who attended the workshop in February. Yay! And she reminded me that Ipswich has a very active student environmental club that has hosted climate change cafes. Great. Were you wanting to speak? We'd love to hear what you have to say. No pressure.
I'm a little nervous, I think, about speaking.
Well, we can't see you, so go ahead.
I just brought it up because I know we're talking about looking at like neighboring communities, their priority actions and their MVP meetings and all of that stuff. And I'm from Groveland, but I've been a part of some of the climate cafes, and I know that Ipswich especially has a very strong e-club, and they've managed to get a lot done over the past few years. And I was kind of wondering if they had already done something like this, or see what their priority actions are, or if they're planning on doing one in the future, because that would be something to look at also if we're going to look at neighboring communities. I think that would be a cool one.
Yeah. Ellie, do you know about the Ipswich action items?
I know that can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm, yep. So I know that Ipswich went through the planning process. I don't know exactly what their recommendations were specifically, but I think that's a great idea with sort of teaming up on the climate cafes and getting, spreading the wealth with that, because I know they're very active in Newburyport and Newbury And I think they've been reaching out and sort of cross-training across the different school systems. It's really a very innovative and effective program, it seems, to get kids, you know, to have these conversations with adults and lead these conversations and really get people thinking about them in a different way. And I think it would be great to sort of look across municipalities with those programs in mind.
Yeah, and this is Nancy again. I'll add to that. So the West Newbury E-Club is relatively new this year, and they were able to host one climate cafe in West Newbury, and we were planning another one for the spring, when kind of like living room cafes, when the you know, the quarantine kind of put that on hold. I think they are doing some remotely through Zoom. I think they are testing it. Ipswich and some of the other towns have been more active for a number of years, so I think they are further down the road. But I think it is a good example, looking at the other towns, of when you have students and teachers, students in the pipeline and teachers engaged, how much outreach in the community can be done through using the student population. I've seen how much difference it makes when the students make, you know, start the conversation versus somebody that is older in the community. So it's definitely a really, really good tool that we should definitely use, especially since it's been started. I think, unfortunately, everyone that's involved in the Climate Cafe in West Newbury is graduated. So hopefully you guys will, you know, recruit some new ones. And I see that Hannah is on the phone. So Hannah, if you want to speak a little to that.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about it. We actually have a couple juniors who will still be here next year, or they'll be seniors next year. So luckily we'll still have a couple people at the school who will stay involved with the club and hopefully the climate cafes, which is really great. But kind of what Nancy said, it's been definitely really nice to kind of have that student outreach, which we didn't really have before, especially with all the other towns. Kind of like what Kendall was saying, we've expanded to like Governor's Academy, Masco, Gloucester, Essex Tech, I already said Masco. But I definitely think that in the school, kind of having that student connection is really important to kind of have them involved in these kinds of conversations. So yeah.
That's great, thank you. So Jennifer Hughes, who's with MVPC, has put a comment in that she lives in Ipswich and she can help you make contacts with the Ipswich group. So, or help us if we choose to do it from the core team perspective. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
I see, you know, one thing we need to do is to know who to reach out to in the schools. You know, who are those juniors, you know, well, now seniors. You know, I think it's great if we can engage with them. I guess, you know, that maybe they, you know, we need to identify who they are, or they can self-identify. But
yeah, I think it might be good to have them represented on our, you know, in our discussions when we start to talk about action items. You know, I'd like to have their perspective and
yeah, great.
Going forward.
I agree, and I think a big resource is, I can't remember her last name, Sandra, who was the teacher, who was the environmental club person, who was also at the workshop. I think that she could be incredibly helpful in, hopefully we can engage. I mean, I think these young folks are just amazing, and boy, if we can engage them, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing. The kind of one person that's involved in all the climate cafes in all the towns is Sherry Molto. This is her brainchild. So we'll loop her in too. But I think if it seems like if this is something we really want to like boost up Sandra's been wonderful in school, and Hannah can speak to that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a teacher in the school to support the students. The students need a lot of support to do that. We ask them to do amazing things. It could be anybody that's on this call if they want to like help the students and guide them through this process as well.
Okay, I think that's all of the comments that are in, or if anybody calling in on the phone wants to make a comment or ask a question, you can unmute yourself and do that.
I see Hannah has said she can definitely give contact names. So I don't know how we want to collect those contact names, but that would be great, Hannah.
Hannah, you have my email address. This is Lisa. So why don't you just email it?
Okay, she will. Thanks. All right, I think it's 8 o'clock. If there are no other questions, or if anything comes up between now and July 9th, feel free to leave a message or respond to the email. I don't know if you can put that slide back up, Nancy.
Yeah, just typing it in.
Yeah. So this session was recorded and it will be available on the MVP page of the town website, a link to it. If you know of anybody that couldn't make it and is interested, please encourage them to watch it. And I think that's it. Thank you all very much for participating. We appreciate it. Have a good night.
Great.